Well, then let's turn to the Cold War, because that is, of course, when you can trace a lot of the systemic issues with our national security state
Mhm.
to, and where the complete, uh, I would call it institutional opacity. I don't even never know how to. Yeah, sure. Where that becomes like incredibly institutional. The you kind of trace this back to the Manhattan Project
Mhm.
in particular. Take us through that period of history when secrecy becomes so congealed in the federal government.
Yeah, so the Manhattan Project, it was like the prototype, of what a special access program would be. And, now we have thousands of these. Even the government can't even tell us like how many special access programs there are. But the Manhattan Project was the first of its kind. And what that means basically is that the fact itself, the fact the United States was developing atomic weapons was classified as top secret. And the only people allowed to know that, were people who were said to have a need to know. That didn't include, for example, the vice president of the United States, like Harry Truman himself, wasn't allowed to know about the atomic bomb project until Roosevelt died and he became president. And so, the Manhattan Project like took things to new extremes, but it also like developed a whole system where you have like levels of secrecy, top secret, secret, confidential, and so on. And you also had these silos, these special access programs, where even people with top secret clearances wouldn't necessarily be allowed to know what was happening in these other programs. So this is in part, a Cold War story. It's one that begins during the Second World War, begins at Pearl Harbor, I would say. But it's not only about the Cold War, because when you actually look back and you get access, for example, to like top secret war plans, what you find is that in the 1960s, the Pentagon was running wargaming scenarios where they were imagining race war in the United States, right? So it wasn't only about the Soviet Union.
Mm.
Like they had all kinds of anxieties that they played out in these top secret wargaming scenario exercises, right? So there's a lot of history here that still is incredibly relevant, to some of the things we're confronting today.
Well, I mean, the national security state attempted to make that connection by like some of these civil rights groups. Hey, they may be communists, in the subversives in the U.S. And then that just explodes everything, of course. And I'm not sure. There's so much we don't know, so I might ask you to speculate a little here.
Mhm.
But we've talked on this program about the JFK assassination many times. There are new questions, thankfully, I think, being brought about the Martin Luther King assassination and what authorities did or did not know, what their involvement was or was not.
Mhm.
Like this entire period of the assassination of political leaders and civil rights leaders, it cannot be a coincidence that this is also a time where the national security state it's feeling itself and
Mhm.
knows we are the ultimate secret organization on the planet. And we still don't have the information that we need to actually cover that history accurately.
Yeah. I think, there are some who will never be satisfied, with the official explanations, whether it's about the MLK assassination or John F. Kennedy, and with good reason, because unfortunately, like for far too long, all too much of that history was covered up. And, once we learn more, we find out, that in fact, the Pentagon intelligence community, the CIA, they did undertake programs, right, where they were training people to become assassins. And they actually did have plans, to carry out assassinations, even when the United States, right? So some of this stuff, it sounds like Hollywood thrillers when we're talking about like Project MK Ultra, for example, or Project Northwoods. It's the kind of stuff where unless you show people the actual documents, they still won't believe you. But
Hmm.
the fact is, our government really did, train assassins, and they really did have plans to carry out assassinations within the United States. For example, to provide a pretext for the invasion of Cuba, for example. So there are good reasons why people have these kinds of suspicions. My own sense of it, though, is that at the end of the day, as scandalous as these things are, and as much as we still need to learn, a lot of what they classify as top secret is actually not that interesting. I mean, to me, that's a whole other aspect of this.
Well, maybe the most interesting stuff is not left on a paper trail is part of it, probably, right? But I mean, there's a reason Trump just didn't release those additional JFK records when they were supposed to be calendar-wise released, right? What was that, 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah. Well, there are parts, of the government that will never agree to the release of anything that they call, sources and methods, right? So like to take an example, I think it's almost certainly the case, the National Security Agency was using all of its capabilities, to intercept communications, to decode them. Certainly in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination, I'm sure the CIA was using all of its assets, as much as it could all around the world to learn more about it. They're not going to want to tell us, even about 1963, technology for decryption. They're not going to want to tell us about the identities of covert assets, even though it's 60 years later. They'll say things, for example, that, the fact that they were working for the United States is something that could still endanger their children or even their grandchildren, right? So there are things, I could well imagine that these agencies could, according to their own logic anyway, still want to keep secret all this time. And they're all also, and again, I'm going to push the boring part. Apparently, a lot of the redactions in these records, they're things like CIA file numbers. Like, right. Believe it or not, like for some reason, the CIA feels like their filing system is something where even if the individual numbers of individual files are disclosed, somehow it's going to blow up the United States. So sometimes, the kind of secrecy we're talking about, it could be very sinister, but sometimes it could be kind of banal.
Well, it's also just the paranoia that a bloated kind of militaristic empire engenders, right? Where we've gotten so large, so wealthy, so imperialistic in a modern sense that there becomes like an internal paranoia that you that you see within some of these institutions. I would guess that trickles down. Mm-hmm. To some of the agents, workers there, and also just how bipartisan this is, this commitment to secrecy. You rightly point out that under the Obama administration, there were more prosecutions under the Espionage Act than in many more times over than in the previous administrations before it. I think, but a lot of us, like liberals, me at the time, getting excited about Obama, people might not know that because that kind of secrecy and underhandedness is often associated with the Bush administration, but it's bipartisan here.
Yeah, well, Obama promised the most transparent administration in history, but under his watch, the number of times officials classified information reached an all-time high. It was 94 million times in 2012. That's 3 times every second, right? And like you said, like more people were prosecuted under the Espionage Act for leaking information to journalists than all previous administrations combined. And so as much as presidents like come in, promising greater transparency and accountability, presidents find in secrecy a kind of sovereign power. They get to decide what the rest of us are allowed to know when they could say it's protected because of national security. And Congress and the courts have not provided any effective check on this otherwise unlimited power, right? And so when you use the word imperial, I think it's the right word because, what is empire but ruling over other people without having to answer to them, right? So, of course, this is even more the case, when the U.S. is running covert operations around the world, right? When we're carrying out a targeted killing program where hundreds, ultimately thousands of people are being killed under secret circumstances and according to president's secret orders. But, it matters also, when the American people aren't even allowed to know about the surveillance of the American public, because if the American people can't hold our leaders to account, then ultimately who can?
Yeah, it's undemocratic is really what it comes down to. The breadth of the holding of these kinds of secrets and what is determined to be